via the Training Institute. I will be monitoring the chat, and if you need that link, just let me know during the presentation. Dr. Hawley's presentation will be about an hour, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A afterwards. Okay, so let me bring up my bio for Dr. Hawley. Amanda Jean Hawley, who holds both a BSW and an MSW, and is a doctoral candidate here with us, is a licensed clinical social worker in Wyoming and Oregon, whose scholarly and professional interests focus on culturally responsive supervision, student support, and equitable access to social work education. Originally from Wyoming, Hawley earned her Bachelor of Social Work in 2018 and her MSW in 2019. And she achieved clinical licensure in 2021 before moving to Oregon. Her scholarship is informed by lived experience and as a biracial individual, and a sustained commitment to advancing access and support for minority and non-traditional students in higher ed. Hawley serves as a clinical licensure supervisor and clinical internship coordinator at New Narrative Integrative Mental Health, a nonprofit community mental health organization in Portland, Oregon. In this role, she provides supervision to provisionally licensed clinicians and MSW practicum students and coordinates field placements across 8 universities nationwide. Her professional background includes crisis response, suicide prevention education, work with transitional aged youth, and services for adults with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. Wow, what a mouthful. I don't think I even realized how much experience Amanda has. So with that, soon to be Dr. Hawley, please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Scanlon. And hello to everyone who is here. I didn't expect so many of you, so thank you so much for coming. And welcome to my Doctor of Social Work capstone presentation. Again, my name is Amanda Hawley. I use she, they pronouns. And my project is called Practicum as Pedagogy, Developing a Culturally Responsive Supervision Curriculum for Social Work Education. I wanted to take a moment and thank a bunch of the people, most of you in this room, who have helped me get to this point. This work is dedicated first and foremost to my students and supervisees who have really helped shape my growth as a professional and really ignited my passion for cultural responsive supervision. Y'all's courage and commitment to showing up every day and doing this hard work continues to inspire me. I also wanted to thank my husband, Tyler. Thank you for your steady support, care, and all the ways you carried me through this process by making dinner and cleaning a lot, and also helping to hang wallpaper in my office the night before this presentation. I also wanted to thank my family and friends. Thank you all for your grace, love, and understanding through missed moments and full seasons and semesters of school. I want to welcome in and honor my ancestors and all of those who walked before me and made it possible for me to have a seat at this table. Thank you to all my colleagues and my organization, New Narrative, for supporting this vision of an intentional, equitable clinical practice. And finally, again, thank you to all of you who are here for witnessing this work, and I'm grateful to share this moment with you. Okay, so our agenda today, I will introduce you to this presentation and the problem that we are going to be discussing. I have 3 capstone products to show y'all today: my systematic literature review, my theoretical conceptual paper, and my practical application. We will also go over the synthesis and findings of all of these, the implications for practice and education, and my final recommendations and conclusion. By the end of this presentation today, I hope that you will all be able to describe the gaps in current practicum supervision, explain the integrated developmental model and feedback-informed treatment/feedback-informed supervision integration, identify components of a culturally responsive supervision curriculum, and apply insights to practicum or education. Okay, so before we dive into everything, I want to do a quick reflection. So take a second, pull out your phones, and think about a moment you had with a supervisor, a mentor, or an instructor who really impacted you personally or professionally. What made that relationship meaningful for you? So if you guys could take out your phones and go to menti.com or scan that QR code and type in the code, it will take you, and we're going to build a quick little word cloud of what that relationship looked like to you and what that meant to you. You might think of supportive, trusting, challenging, safety. And what we tend to hear in moments like these are words like I just mentioned. And so what we want to think about isn't just about what they taught us, but how they showed up in the relationship with us. Research strongly supports a close working mentor relationship. A high quality supervisory or mentoring relationship is one of the most important factors in student learning, professional identity development, and retention. So bear with me, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and go over to the Mentimeter, and then I will bring us back. Okay. I don't know if I can make this much bigger, but I will just call out some of the words that are appearing. So we have accountable, reflective, thoughtful, attentive, inspiring, empathetic, really big, meaning multiple people submitted that, supportive, fun, humanity, listening, real relationship, not just a professional one, but a deep personal and professional relationship. Responsive, honest, encouraging, perspective, patience and trust, understanding, unconditional support, passion. I love that. I also wanted to highlight safety and integrity, flexible and diverse. Okay. Thank you guys so much for doing that. And let me get back to our main presentation. Okay, quick thumbs up if we're back. Perfect, thank you guys. Okay, so again, the research supports that we need a strong personal and professional working relationship. But what we know is that not all students are experiencing these kinds of relationships equally in their practicum placements or in their jobs. And so this is where the equity lens becomes critical. While many of us can point to that meaningful relationship that helped us thrive, the reality is that access across that relationship is not equitably distributed. So that gap is part of what this project needs to respond to. So now that we have got our brains primed and ready to think about mentorship and supervision, I want to ground us in the key terms that are going to shape the work and the presentation today. So throughout the presentation, you'll notice that I intentionally use the term practicum rather than field placement. This is a deliberate word language change because we know that language carries power. And part of this work is being mindful about how our terminology reflects or challenges historical inequities in social work education. When I refer to practicum supervision, I'm talking about more than just oversight. I'm talking about a formal educational relationship. It includes direct instruction, modeling, feedback, and supporting students in becoming self-directed learners. Next, culturally responsive supervision extends from culturally responsive pedagogy. At its core, it means that we are actively centering student identities, lived experiences, and perspectives in the learning process. This isn't an add-on, it is foundational to creating relational safety and meaningful engagement. The Integrated Developmental Model, or IDM, throughout the presentation helps us to think about supervision as a developmental process. It reminds us that student needs different types of support and challenges depending on where they are at in their stages of growth. In tandem with that, feedback-informed treatment and supervision, noted as FIT, or FIS, introduces structured ongoing feedback loops. This is about making supervision more collaborative, ensuring that supervisee voice is centered and that we're adjusting in real-time increments. And finally, the Supervisory Working Alliance emphasizes that relationship itself, shared goals, shared tasks, and trust. The literature consistently shows that this relationship is one of the strongest predictors in supervision outcomes. Now that we have been introduced to the terms that will be utilized throughout the presentation, I do want to provide a brief overview of the capstone. So to begin, the capstone asserts that practicum supervision serves as the signature pedagogy or art and science of social work education. This means that practicum supervision must be grounded in cultural responsiveness in order to meet the diverse needs of our students. The framework listed on the slides, or the frameworks listed on the slides, are the main theories and evidence-based practices that will form the culturally responsive framework. This slide provides a visual overview about how the capstone project is structured and how each component continues to build upon the next. Starting on the top left is our research question, which asks how the integration of the integrated developmental model and feedback-informed supervision can promote culturally responsive practicum supervision in social work education. This question drives the entire project. From there, we move into the systematic literature review, shown here also on the left side. The SLR highlights what we already know, particularly the importance of that supervisory relationship. We see consistent evidence that strong supervisory alliances are linked to increased reflexivity, help-seeking, and overall student well-being. The literature also points to best practices like person-centered supervision and cross-cultural trainings. But just as importantly, the SLR also helps identify the key gaps. Specifically, we see a lack of integration across developmental models, feedback-informed practices, and culturally responsive approaches. These elements are often discussed in isolation rather than in one cohesive framework. That gap is what leads directly into the conceptual frameworks on the right side. Here, I bring together IDM and FIT as complementary models, one providing the developmental structure and other offering the ongoing collaborative feedback loops. Together, they can create that strong foundation for culturally responsive, student-centered supervision. Finally, this integration is operationalized through the practice application, shown at the bottom right. This is where the theory becomes actionable. The model is translated into a structured, scalable supervision that curriculum includes developmental checklists, goal-setting tools, feedback loops, and reflective prompts. So overall, this project follows a clear progression. The literature review identifies both the strengths and gaps, the conceptual framework responds to these gaps, and the practice applications brings to that framework into real-world supervision practice. The flow is what positions supervision not just as a task, but as an intentional, cultural responsive, pedagogical process. So, before continuing to zoom in further into the SLR, I wanted to additionally ground us in why practicum supervision matters. I've told you a few reasons, but central to my project, at its core, practicum supervision is that single pillar to professional identity formation. It is one of the primary spaces where students begin to understand not just what social work is, but who they really are as social workers. It also directly shapes ethical practice and confidence. The way supervision is structured and the quality of that relationship influences how students make decisions, engages with client populations, and develops a sense of competence in their work. However, despite its importance, practicum supervision is often inconsistently structured. There isn't always a clear intentional framework guiding how supervision is taught or practiced across settings. And critically, it often lacks explicit cultural responsiveness. While values of equity and inclusion are central and present in social work, they are not always intentionally or consistently integrated into supervision practices. So we continue to have this tension. Supervision is incredibly impactful, but not always intentionally designed or equitably experienced. And that tension is what sets the stage for our systematic literature review. To answer my research question, I conducted the SLR using a structured and intentional search process to identify relevant research. Rather than relying on a few key articles, I utilized a comprehensive search strategy across 10 academic databases spanning social work, education, psychology, and other health-related disciplines. This helped to ensure that I was capturing a broad and interdisciplinary understanding of supervision practices. For each database, I applied a tailored string of search tools combining a controlled vocabulary like subject headings and free text keywords. I used Boolean operators to refine and expand the search, allowing me to capture both the theoretical and empirical literature relevant to the topic. Through this process, I developed a robust set of search terms and synonyms aligned with my core concepts, specifically the integrated developmental model, feedback-informed supervision, and culturally responsive practicum supervision. Overall, this approach was designed to ensure a comprehensive coverage and methodological rigor, strengthening the foundation for all of the findings that I'll share next. On the following slide, I will walk you through the Prisma flow diagram along with the tools that I use, the EndNote and Rayon softwares, to organize and screen and clean the literature. Using the search strategy I just described, the initial database search yielded a broad set of articles which I organized using EndNote to manage and categorize the literature. From there, I grouped the articles into 4 key areas aligning with my research question: culturally responsive supervision, feedback-informed treatment, IDM, and practicum supervision best practices. To support a more rigorous screening process, I then uploaded all of the articles into the Rayon software where duplicates were removed, and I conducted a multi-stage review. This included an initial screening of titles and abstracts using predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria, followed by a full text review to confirm eligibility. This structured process ensured that the final sets of articles was both relevant and methodologically sound. In total, 37 articles met the inclusion criteria and were synthesized for this review. I also used a standard data extraction process to ensure consistency across the studies, capturing key information like study purpose and findings to support comparison of synthesis. What emerged from this analysis is that while the frameworks are often discussed separately, their integration is particularly powerful. Specifically, coupling IDM with feedback-informed treatment creates a supervision approach that is broadly developmental and attuned and feedback-rich. When combined with the culturally responsive practices identified in the literature, this integrated approach supports a supervision process that is adaptable, relational, and responsive to diverse student needs, ultimately strengthening the practicum learning experience. This visual breakdown can be seen on the slide. To ensure that the studies included in this review were both relevant and high quality, I applied clearly defined inclusion criteria aligned with the research question. I focused on studies that examined IDM, feedback-informed supervision, or both, as these are the core frameworks that guide the project. I also included research that addressed culturally responsive supervision, multicultural competence, or equity within supervision contexts, particularly within social work practicum or field education. While the primary focus was on social work, I intentionally included studies from related disciplines like counseling, psychology, and education when their frameworks were transferable. This helped broaden the scope while still maintaining relevance. In terms of study type, I included peer-reviewed articles, empirical studies, theoretical papers, and systems reviews and dissertations published between 2005 and 2025, with a few foundational works included for context. One important note is that I did intentionally not exclude the term field in my search strategy. While I use practicum in this project as a best practices language shift, the literature is not fully shifted. So this ensured that I captured the most comprehensive set of relevant studies. Overall, this criteria helped to ensure both the breadth and alignment with the goals of the review. In addition to defining what to include, it was important to equally clearly define what to exclude to maintain focus and rigor. I excluded studies that examined supervision in medical or corporate settings without relevance to helping professions or student learning, as these do not align with the context of social work education. I also excluded articles from unrelated disciplines that did not offer transferable supervision frameworks, as well as studies that lacked a focus on cultural responsiveness, equity, or inclusion. To ensure quality, I also excluded works that were not peer-reviewed, as well as non-scholarly sources like opinion pieces, book reviews, and commentaries. Additionally, articles were excluded if they were not available in English, lacked full-text access, or were not accessible through academic databases. Finally, I excluded studies that relied on outdated supervision models that do not incorporate developmental, feedback-informed, or culturally responsive approaches unless they were used for background context. These exclusion criteria help to ensure that the final set of studies remain focused, relevant, and aligned with contemporary supervision practices. What emerged from the literature were several consistent themes that highlight what makes practicum supervision effective. First, the Supervisory Working Alliance stood out as foundational. Across the studies, strong relationships characterized by trust, transparency, and mutual respect were directly linked to student learning, identity development, and overall well-being. Closely connected to that is psychological safety. When students feel safe to ask questions, make mistakes, and be authentic in supervision, they are more likely to engage deeply and take risks in their learning. Without that safety, we see increased disengagement and burnout, particularly among students from marginalized backgrounds. Another key theme is developmental learning. The literature supports the idea that supervision should evolve alongside the student's level of competence, providing more structure early on and gradually increasing autonomy. We also see strong support for feedback and outcome monitoring, structured, ongoing feedback, especially when it centers student voice, enhances reflection, accountability, and growth. And finally, cultural responsiveness is consistently identified as essential. Effective supervision must actively engage with culture, identity, and power, not just as an abstract value, but an ongoing relational practice. While the literature highlights a lot of what works, it also reveals several important gaps. One of the most significant gaps is the lack of a clearly structured supervision curriculum. Even though practicum is considered the signature pedagogy of social work, supervision is informal and inconsistently implemented. There's also a limited use of structured feedback systems. While feedback is recognized as important, it is not systematically integrated into supervision in a consistent or measurable way. Another gap is the inconsistent application of developmental models. Frameworks like the integrated developmental model have existed for decades, but they are not always applied intentionally or consistently in practice. And importantly, cultural responsiveness is often implicit rather than explicit. While many supervisors value equity and inclusion, the principles are not clearly operationalized within supervision practices. Taken together, these gaps reveal a disconnect between what we know is effective and how supervision is actually implemented. So what we see in the literature is a clear pattern: strong ideas, but often operating in isolation. This project responds to that gap by bringing these elements together into a unified conceptual framework, linking the integrated developmental model and feedback-informed supervision to support that culturally responsive practicum supervision. This work is presented in my conceptual paper titled Linking IDM and Feedback-Informed Supervision to Promote Culturally Responsive Practicum Supervision in Social Work Education. This slide highlights the core frameworks that make up the foundation of the integrated supervision model, and more importantly, each one contributes a distinct piece to the whole. Integrated developmental model, or IDM, serves as that developmental backbone and that stage progression. It helps guide how supervision over time, ensuring that support and challenges are aligned with students' growth level and competence. Feedback-informed treatment and supervision brings in the intentional feedback loops. This is what creates the structure around reflection, accountability, and increasing ongoing dialogues to ensure that supervision is not assumed to be effective but actively monitored and adjusted. Borden's supervisory working alliance theory provides the relational foundation. It emphasizes the importance of shared goals, collaborative tasks, and trust, elements that the literature consistently identifies as central to the effective forms of supervision. And finally, decolonial frameworks, specifically Brayboy's tribal critical race theory, ground the model in a justice-oriented and culturally responsive lens. These perspectives push us to critically examine power, center marginalized voices, and ensure that supervision is not only effective but equitable and accountable to the communities we serve. So rather than functioning separately or in isolation, these frameworks work together. IDM structuring development, FIT ensuring feedback and responsiveness, the Working Alliance anchoring the relationship, and decolonial and tribal critical race theory perspectives guide the equity and cultural responsiveness. We will see this presented in a conceptual map on the next slide. This busy slide represents the conceptual model developed in the paper, bringing together those core frameworks we just discussed into that cohesive supervision approach. The model highlights the idea that practicum supervision is a relational process and not that administrative oversight, but that intentional space for learning, identity, development, and growth. You'll see that the model is structured around several interconnected components. The conceptual framework grounded in the IDM model reflects how students progress over time. Supervision is intentionally scaffolded to match evolving competence, confidence, and autonomy. Layered into that is the feedback processes informed by feedback-informed supervision. This introduces ongoing feedback loops to support reflection, accountability, and the continuous adjustment, and ensures that supervision remains collaborative and responsive rather than static. At the same time, the entire model is held together by the theoretical and relational foundations of the Supervisory Working Alliance. This emphasizes trust, shared goals, and mutual engagement as essential conditions for learning. Informing these components and justice-oriented lens grounded in decolonial frameworks such as tribal critical race theory. This ensures that issues of power, identity, and systemic inequity are not peripheral but central to the supervision process. What this map illustrates is that these elements are not separate, they are interdependent. Development, feedback, relationships, and cultural responsiveness are continuously interacting to shape the supervision experience. Ultimately, this conceptual model responds directly to the gaps identified in the literature by offering a more integrated, structured, and equity-centered approach to practicum supervision. Up until this point, we focused on identifying the gaps in the literature and developing the conceptual framework to address them. This section shifts into the practical application, where the goal is to translate the theory into practice. This paper is titled Curricular Evaluation Through the Pedagogical Redesign of Supervision, Implications for Learning, Gatekeeping, and Equity, and it is grounded in a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SOTL, lens. From a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning perspective, practicum supervision is not just something we do, it is something we intentionally design, implement, and evaluate as a form of teaching and learning. So rather than reviewing supervision as informal or purely administrative, it works and positions it as a structured pedagogical intervention with clear goals, processes, and outcomes. Building on the fusion of IDM and FIT and culturally informed practices, this paper translates those concepts into a culturally responsive curriculum. The goal is to create a model that is not only theoretically sound, but also practical, scalable, and evaluable within real-world practicum settings. This conceptual map illustrates how the conceptual framework translates into the practical application grounded in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning approach. Meaning supervision again is intentionally designed, implemented, and evaluated as a form of teaching and learning. At the center and the core, you will see the problem to the model, which is responding to inconsistent and inequitable practicum supervisions. The literature highlights that supervision lacks that developmental structure, relies on subjective evaluation, and does not consistently integrate that feedback or cultural considerations. The left side of the model brings together the two foundational inputs, IDM providing the structure for the learning progress over time, ensuring supervision is aligned with student growth. Alongside that is the equity-oriented supervision that centers cultural humility, power, positionality, and anti-racist practices, ensuring that supervision is critically reflective and justice-oriented. Moving to the right side, we see that the relational and feedback-informed components are there. This includes the working alliance and psychological safety, structured feedback tools like the outcomes rating scales or the sessions rating scales, as well as the leads, alliance, and supervision scale. These elements ensure that supervision remains collaborative, transparent, and responsive to student needs. Moving toward the center bottom is the intervention itself, the culturally responsive supervision curriculum designed as the SOTL informed practice. This includes a 9-month developmental sequence, structured reflection prompts, feedback tools, ongoing alliance monitoring, and intentional dialogue around culture and power. What's important here is that all of these elements are working together, not in isolation, to create that intentional, equitable supervision experience. As you move further to the bottom of the slide, you can see that the outcomes in this model are designed to support. This includes improved learning and self-efficacy, more equitable gatekeeping practices, stronger client outcomes, and ultimately increased student success, belonging, and professional identity development. This model moves supervision from that informal inconsistency to structured, relational, and accountable to both learning and equity outcomes. The next slide will break this down further into the specific curriculum components and how they are implemented in practice. Again, this intervention is a 9-month supervision curriculum aligned with the typical length of a social work practicum experience, aiming to provide a structured yet flexible framework that supports student development over time. It will include 3 student developmental phases and an additional pre-practicum phase called Phase 0. This phase is for supervisors designed to educate and orient them to the framework. Phase 1 for students is orientation, safety, and identity building. Phase 2 is skills development, power, and cultural reflexivity. And Phase 3 is the final portion covering autonomy, advocacy, and professional integration. On the left is an example of how a supervision session might be structured. The supervisor generally completes a check-in with the student like a rosebud thorn or a pie check-in. If the agency utilizes feedback-informed treatment as an evidence-based practice or other routine outcome measurement tools to elicit client feedback, the supervisor would look at the client feedback data with the student and complete a case conceptualization with them. Next, the supervisor might engage in a reflective discussion centered around cultural humility or supervisee identity growth. This would be followed by goal setting or progress review before finally engaging the student in an intentional self-care check-in conversation and completion of the leads, alliance, and supervision scale or other formal or informal feedback tools or conversations to elicit feedback about the supervisory relationship. Evaluation of student development and progress could include reviewing client outcomes data, checking in on the mentoring relationship, using supervisory alliance measurement tools, engaging the student in reflective narrative conversations, or by utilizing process recordings. Things to consider when implementing this framework are the time considerations, the training needs of supervisors, the cultural of the organizations, and access to resources. For example, does your agency invest in the use of client feedback data, such as OpenFit, or do you have the ability to complete the training requirements outlined in this curriculum? The next few slides will break this down further into the specific implementation phases and how they are enacted in supervision. So, before the curriculum with the students begins, it starts with Phase 0, the supervisor preparation. This phase is critical because it addresses what is often referred to as the hidden curriculum in practicum education. The reality is that many supervisors are expected to teach and mentor students without formal training in pedagogy or supervision frameworks. To address this, all practicum supervisors must participate in a targeted training sequence totaling between 4 to 6 hours. This training modules focus on key areas including anti-racist supervision foundations, cross-cultural supervision, reflexivity, and critical conversations around power, positionality, and privilege. Supervisors are also introduced to the core frameworks that guide the model, including the integrated developmental model, feedback-informed treatment and supervision, as well as other decolonial and tribal critical race theory perspectives that ground our work in the justice-oriented lens. The goal of this phase is not just knowledge building, but skill development. By the end of this training, supervisors are prepared to identify a student's developmental stage, model cultural humility and reflexivity, and use feedback tools in a way that is collaborative rather than punitive. They are also equipped to recognize how power and positionality shape the supervisory relationship and to apply anti-racist and decolonial practices within their supervision. So, Phase 0 ensures that supervisors are not just participating in the model, but are intentionally prepared to enact it, creating a consistent, equitable learning environment for students. This slide represents Phase 1 of the curriculum, which aligns with the early practicum or beginner stages of development. You'll notice that each phase is intentionally structured using two key elements, the integrated developmental model profile and the pedagogical focus. This helps supervisors clearly understand where the student is developmentally and how to respond as an educator. For this phase, the IDM profile reflects what we typically see in early learners: high anxiety, low autonomy, and a need for strong structure. So rather than viewing that as a deficit, the curriculum treats it as a normal and expected part of development, and its supervision is designed to respond accordingly. The pedagogical focus in this phase centers establishing psychological safety and building the supervisory working relationship. This also is where students begin forming their professional identity and are introduced to cultural reflexivity and are supported in normalizing uncertainty within their practice. In terms of learning objectives, students are working toward being able to articulate their professional values, explore their social identities and positionality, and begin developing reflective practice habits. They are also introduced to supervision as a collaborative learning process rather than an evaluative one. Reflection is a key component here. Prompts encourage students to think about how their identity shows up in practice, where they are experiencing uncertainty, and what assumptions they hold about competence. And finally, feedback is introduced early, but intentionally framed as a learning tool, not as an evaluation. Students complete the Leads, Alliance, and Supervision scale and are introduced to the tools like the ORS and SRS to begin building comfort with feedback and reflection. Overall, Phase 1 is about creating a safe, structured, relational foundation that supports both learning and identity from development at the very beginning. Phase 2 is the middle phase of the curriculum, which aligns with the intermediate stages of development. At this stage, students often experience fluctuating confidence, increased self-awareness, and sometimes heightened emotional reactivity. As they begin to understand the complexity of their work, they may feel both more capable and more uncertain at the same time. The pedagogical focus shifts accordingly, from building safety to deepening clinical thinking and critical analysis. This includes developing stronger case conceptualization skills, integrating cultural humility and anti-racist practices, and engaging in more explicit power analysis within client systems. Ethical decision-making also becomes more central during this phase. Students are learning to treat feedback as data, something to actively engage with and use to guide their practice. In terms of learning objectives, students are working to integrate cultural and structural analysis into their cases by identifying power dynamics and engaging in more intentional, reflexive, and meaning-making ways. Reflection prompts in this phase encourage students to explore how power is operating, what patterns are emerging in client feedback, and where they might be experiencing discomfort or resistance in their practices. Feedback integration also becomes more consistent and applied. Tools like the ORS and SRS are reviewed regularly, and the Supervisory Alliance is monitoring using the LAS. Supervision begins to focus intentionally more on cases that are not progressing, using the feedback to guide intervention and learning. Phase 2 is about helping students move from awareness to integration, connecting theory, feedback, identity, and practice in a more intentional and critical way. Phase 3 is the final stage of the curriculum. where students are moving toward professional readiness and greater autonomy. As with the previous phases, this stage is guided by the IDM profile and the pedagogical focus. At this level, students typically demonstrate increased confidence and a more stable professional identity, and the ability to think systemically, not just about individual clients, but about the broader context and shaping practice. The pedagogical focus shifts toward the application and leadership. This includes engaging in advocacy and systems-level practice, strengthening interprofessional collaboration, and emphasizing service user accountability. This phase also introduces ethical gatekeeping, where supervision supports students in meeting their professional standards while still maintaining that developmental and relational approach. In terms of learning objectives, students are expected to demonstrate professional autonomy, integrate service user feedback into their practices, and reflect more deeply on their professional purpose and responsibility to communities. Reflection in this phase becomes more future-oriented and values-driven. Prompts ask students to consider questions like, how am I accountable to the communities I serve? What kind of social worker do I want to become? Feedback is used in a more integrative way. The Supervisory Alliance is reflective summatively, and tools like the ORS and SRS are reviewed longitudinally to help students see patterns in their growth over time. The final supervision conversation often center on what students have learned about power, learning, responsibility, and tying together both their professional development and ethical commitments. Phase 3 is about moving from supported learning to intentional, accountable, and self-directed professional practice. Now we've come to the synthesis and findings of the entire capstone project. We are synthesizing what was emerged from the literature, the conceptual framework, and the practice application we just reviewed. At the highest level, 4 key findings stood out. First, supervision is fundamentally relational. Across all the components of the project, the supervisory relationship is grounded in trust, safety, and collaboration, and remains the foundation for meaningful learning. Second, development must be structured. While growth is naturally nonlinear, it cannot be left to chance. Intentional developmental scaffolding is essential to supporting student progression. Third, feedback enhances accountability. When feedback is integrated consistently and collaboratively, it strengthens reflection, supports learning, and connects supervision to client outcomes. And fourth, cultural responsiveness must be explicit. It cannot remain an implicit value. We have to intentionally integrate conversations around identity, power, and equity into supervision practice. When we look at these findings thematically, they align into 4 key areas: relational foundation, developmental progression, feedback integration, and cultural responsiveness. What this project demonstrates is that these elements are most impactful when they are intentionally integrated rather than addressed in isolation. And when that integration happens, we see meaningful outcomes, including stronger professional identity development, increased psychological safety, and improved supervision quality, and ultimately more equitable learning environments for our students. So this synthesis reinforces the central argument of the capstone, that supervision, when designed as a structured, relational, and cultural responsive pedagogy, it has the potential to significantly transform practicum education. The implications of this work are for social work education, practice, and leadership. Starting with education, one of the key takeaways is that supervision should be treated as curriculum, not just informal or secondary component of practicum education. When we approach supervision as a structured pedagogical process, we create a more consistent, meaningful learning experience for our students. This also points to a clear need for intentional supervisor training. We cannot assume that strong clinicians automatically have the skills to teach and support and evaluate students effectively. In addition, the integration of standardized feedback practices, like those used in this model, can help strengthen accountability, reflection, and alignment between student learning and client outcomes. And importantly, cultural humility must be embedded throughout supervision rather than treated as an add-on. This requires an intentional dialogue around identity, power, and equity within the supervisory relationship. Looking at implications for practice and leadership, this model has the potential to improve overall supervision quality by providing a clear, structured, and relationally grounded framework. It also supports a more consistent and equitable ethical gatekeeping practices, ensuring that evaluation is aligned with both developmental growth and professional standards. At the organizational level, this approach can enhance supervision practices more broadly, contributing to strong team functioning and learning cultures. Ultimately, it aligns with a shift toward more equity-centered and accountable care, ensuring that both students and communities they serve are better supported. Overall, these implications reinforce that supervision is not a learning tool, it is a critical lever for improving education, practice, and equity within our profession. If we want better outcomes for our clients and communities, we have to start with how we train and support our next generation of social workers. To close, I want to highlight a few key recommendations followed by some final reflections on the overall contribution of this work. First, there is a clear need to implement more structured supervision models. Supervision should not be left to chance. It should be intentionally designed to support student learning and development. Second, we need to train supervisors in frameworks like this integrated developmental model and feedback-informed supervision so that they have the tools to support the students effectively and consistently. Third, incorporating routine feedback tools into supervision can strengthen accountability, reflection, and alignment with client outcomes. It is also critical that we center cultural responsiveness throughout supervision practice. It has to be explicit, ongoing, and embedded, and is not treated as optional. Finally, there has to be continued need for expanding research in this area and evaluation to strengthen this evidence base to support broader implementation of these approaches. In closing, this project reinforces that practicum supervision is not just a requirement, it is a form of pedagogy that shapes how social workers learn, grow, and engage with the world. It also highlights that integration is essential, development, feedback, relationships, and cultural responsiveness cannot operate in isolation if we want to enact meaningful change. And perhaps most importantly, cultural responsiveness is non-negotiable. It must be central to how we design and deliver supervision. This model offers one pathway forward, a way to move supervision from something that is often inconsistent and implicit to something that is intentional, structured, and transformative for both students and the communities that they serve. Again, thank you for your time and attention to this presentation. I know it was a lot of information. This work is deeply rooted in my commitment to supporting students, strengthening supervision, and advancing more equitable social work practice. We now have some time for any questions or comments, and if you really want to see all of the references, you can scan this little QR code.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you so much. As a faculty member here in the college who consistently works in that supervision space with both practicum instructors who are offering supervision, and we are developing a space in Canvas right now to hopefully improve those and make it more consistent. I really appreciate your work in this area.
Thank you.
The floor is open. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask them. And you are also welcome to pop a question in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable about. We have at least another 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Amanda, how did you go about selecting your topic?
Yeah, thank you. Michelle, I really grew into loving supervision. I had a really awesome graduate mentor in my MSW program who helped me get through school, and I didn't think I would get to this point without her. And so she really inspired me and made me want to become a social work professional that also helped other people get a seat at the table who might have been struggling. And so as I supervised BSW students and then MSW students, I just knew that there was more that we could be doing. And again, saying that like I come from a biracial background, knowing that a lot of my classmates that may not have like white passing privilege like I do have a lot more barriers. And so how do we keep them engaged? Because we know that we need practitioners and providers that look like everybody. And so we want to bring them through.
Awesome. That's great.
Gary,
Thank you.
Gary has his hand raised. Thank you, Michelle, for your question.
Yeah, no, it's just more comments than questions because I think it's a very
Sure.
important. And I think the biggest issue, and you mentioned this several times, that a lot of practitioners think they're great supervisors, but they're actually not. I'm teaching field instruction in some other school, and what I find where I actually interact with the supervisors in the field as well as students. And, I actually have to do 15 virtual visits. And it's a great thing when you actually talk to everyone, they give you greatest feedback, but you feel that it's not real. So, fortunately, I have the students in my class, face to face the following week. And as per discussion, my feelings were right. You know what I mean? Because that's when the students say, "Oh, I don't get, no feedback," or "My supervisor doesn't meet with me regularly," or everything you mentioned in your model. It's really, honestly, rarely happen in this field, and it's unfortunate. So I'll definitely review the slides and a model, and I think it's just amazing, and we should promote this, with practitioners, with educators, and with students as well. So amazing work.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that when I started being a practicum supervisor and being like, well, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, I'm here and I want to do the work, but there was no real guidelines. And so I've kind of stumbled my way through and found a lot of things that work. And so hopefully, yeah, this model can be helpful moving forward to folks. Allie.
Hi, Amanda. Great presentation for one. I was kind of curious, I don't supervise MSW or BSW students or anything like that, but I was curious if you think any of your model would be applicable to entry level workers in the social work field.
Yeah, totally. I think that you could follow the same similar phases and starting because when you start a new job, a social work adjacent job as a case manager, as a peer, like you aren't super familiar and you are kind of in that first like forming and storming stage where you're feeling a little bit more insecure. And so having the scaffolding I think could happen and be very helpful without having to have that educational practicum tied to it, right? It could just be a nice progressive process through regular supervision within the field.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Cool.
I'll make a comment,
Yeah.
Amanda. I think what you said about structure, and I know we are looking at several models that will help those of you in the practicum instructor space, such as yourself, have a good structure from which to work with students. I think one of the most challenging things for supervision is there's so many different types of supervision, and supervision can look very differently. Like it could be one-on-one where you're working with a student and you are that agency person who helps them walk that walk. And so you are really deeply connected to the work, you are knowledgeable about the work, and now it's a matter of helping that student grow in their skills and competency. So you start from a real grounded place of knowledge. But then we look to people like you who do one thing in one area, but then they also step into those educational spaces. And we ask you to work with maybe 5 or 6 students who are at 5 or 6 different agencies. And you have to help all 6 of them in a group format understand, well, what does ethical decision making look like in your agency space? Oh, you're not working with clients at all. You're at a macro program development. So what is ethical decision making? So you really need even more and more structure to pivot and adjust on a dime. And we are trying to create some of that. And I think what we hear from students more so than anything, and you touched on it brilliantly in your presentation, is not every student is starting with the same space, right? Some students, ironically enough, are coming into social work and they themselves have a personality that's very reserved, very introverted, very shy, and yet there is a space for them. But you can't meet that person in supervision in the same way that you meet a very extroverted, gregarious, outgoing person, which we might assume, okay, well, they're going to do really well in social work. And yet we need all kinds, because there's all kinds of people to help and all kinds of systems. And so I think you've really touched on how it's so important to meet them where they are with intention. But also, one of the most frustrating things that we hear from students is because the supervisor has not done the work and has not leaned in, they just keep hearing oh, you're doing a great job. You're doing a great job. Well, that's great. Hey, that's good work. It's like, I need more specific feedback. I need my feedback loop to actually contain details that I can really hold on to and grow from. And I think you touched on all that brilliantly in this presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, we got to have students exposed to feedback early on, because it's a professional skill, and feedback can be really difficult for people to hear and receive and like navigate. Mm-hmm. And so if you can get comfortable early on when you're still in school, then you'll be able to navigate it like a pro out in the world.
Right. Can you imagine if everyone embraced critical feedback, leaned in with oh, this is such a teachable moment. How honored am I to get to grow and learn? No. But if we did really good supervision and we set the tone for it that way, we're going to confront the issues, we're going to support the student, then you framed it and you can help students be more successful in that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Any further questions from this very large group?
I think so many people.
Including us, Amanda. I think there were 34 at one point. So.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. Oh, let's see. Allie and Sophie. I'm not sure who raised their hand first, but.
I think I was just wondering, there's so much information covered in the presentation, and you've obviously done so much research. I'm curious if there's any part of it that felt the most exciting or interesting, or that just really stood out to you as something that you just wanted to highlight a little extra.
I think, so two of the frameworks that I used, Borden's working alliance theory was developed in the early 80s, and I'm pretty sure integrated developmental model was late 70s, early 80s. So these are two models that I am using in contemporary time that we've had forever and ever, and they're just still, the research has been done, it's there, and we just still have not gotten there. So I think that was the most salient piece to me, is okay, we have all this wonderful knowledge that works, why aren't we doing it? And so finding that piece and then developing the curriculum was kind of the most fun for me. And I'm excited to kind of work on publishing that and getting it distilled a little further, so that hopefully we can spread this out a little bit. And Allie, did you have another question?
Yeah, it was kind of unrelated to a question regarding your presentation, but how do we do the credit sign up for your awesome presentation?
The CEUs?
Yeah, I put that in the chat at the very top. If you go to the chat, the second link says CEU, and then the last part of that URL is DSW-showcase. And then it'll ask you to either create an account or log in. And then the trick is knowing, once you get to the page with the DSW showcase, you can get really confused. You have to click on the picture that says DSW showcase, and you can go into that, and then you'll just search for Hawley, search for Dr. Hawley's last name, and you'll find it, and you can register for it. And then that way you're linked, and you have your email, and they will email you your certificate.
Okay, because I created the account and then tried to log in again, and it just took me to a dashboard. I'm not sure if I did it
Yeah, the
correctly.
dashboard, and then you click at the top of the page, you'll see DSW showcases.
Okay, thank
Do
you.
you see that? And then
Yeah.
click on that, and then that page looks like there's nothing to do, and then you click on the graphic. It should say click here to look and find the DSW showcases, but it doesn't. You just have to kind of know intuitively to click on that picture. I
Okay,
forget
I
every year.
see
I'm
it.
like, how do I sign up? How do I sign up?
Thank you so much.
You got some great comments in the chat, Amanda, that you'll definitely want to take time to read when it
Definitely, yeah.
downloads. Does anybody else have any questions before Amanda closes out the session? All right.
Awesome.
Thank you all so much. Amanda, any closing words?
No, thank you all so much for being here and listening. And yeah, graduation in like a week, so ready for that.
Yes. Yes.